Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Climate alarmists and the green industrial complex have been warning incessantly that increasing levels of greenhouse gases are purportedly driving atmospheric warming to dangerous and previously unknown levels. They say that higher temperatures are leading to ever-increasing natural disasters, severe weather events, and human health concerns. Is this true? What if just the opposite is true? What if the slight warming caused by man-made greenhouse gases is overwhelmed by natural climate drivers that have been active for hundreds of millions of years? What if, based on thousands of years of historical records documenting temperature and human experience, the possibility of additional warming will be overwhelmingly beneficial to humanity? Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is portrayed as the worst villain in the climate alarmist pantheon of satanic gases. Is this true? What if CO2 is a miracle molecule dramatically improving the Earth's ecosystems and creating the conditions for human flourishing? Well, I'm back with Dr. William Happer, co-founder and chair of the CO2 Coalition, and Greg Wrightstone, its executive director, and they're going to explain why they believe this to be true. Dr. Happer?
Well, Bill, thanks for that introduction. And of course, they have got the sign wrong on CO2. Carbon dioxide is very beneficial to life on Earth. It's at historically low levels. Very seldom in geological history has it been this low. And you can already see that plants are growing much better. Crop yields are going up because of the increase of CO2. So nothing about CO2 is bad. So it's unbelievable that they've managed to turn this beneficial molecule, which you and I breathe out with every breath, into
But what they
pollutant.
say, what Al Gore, that great scientist from Harvard,
Yes.
reliably tells us that CO2 is driving temperatures through the roof, and the oceans will begin foaming, and I can't remember his speech at Davos,
Yes,
but
yes.
it's going to be terrible. And CO2 is the thing that's driving temperatures up. We're going to have droughts and famine. You're saying it's just the opposite.
It's nonsense. You know, we're in a warming period now that began about 1800, maybe a little bit earlier, as we have come out of the Little Ice Age, which was a very cold period, and 1500, 1600. And so most of the warming that we've seen over the last 100 years or so is almost all due to natural causes. There's probably been a little contribution from CO2, but it's not very much, because CO2 is not a very potent greenhouse gas. It's a puny greenhouse gas. It's heavily saturated. It can't do much more than it's already done.
Well, Greg, you've written an amazing book. It's called A Very Convenient Warming, and it's just coming out. It's also on Kindle, and it's astonishing. I mean, just an example of what it might look like. The charts in this book illustrate all the points that Greg and Will are going to make during our show, and you have an interesting chart in here where you show that this has not been a straight line of warming. The Earth has been warming and cooling for millions of years, and in fact, it's been warming and cooling with glaciers receding, coming back in the last 10,000 years, and a lot of the health of humans and human civilizations is tied to those climate cycles.
Yeah, it is. And if we look at particularly the last 10,000 years, and that dates back to the end of the last glacial advance. And so we're in what's called an interglacial warming period. These are on 100,000 year cycles over the last million years or so. And we should be thankful we are in a warming period. But it's important to note that during that 10,000 year period, we had And as Will had said, we are in a warming trend. We should welcome that. But the warming trend we're in looks eerily similar to 9 other warming trends over the last 10,000 years on a cyclical basis. And what's really fascinating are really the last 5,000 years. If we go back to the first great civilizations that rose up, the empires that rose up, each one of those warm periods were correlated closely to the rise of empires, the rise of civilization. Food was bountiful. And we know that these periods were warmer just from historical records where they were growing olives or where they could grow citrus. And so we don't need to take carbon isotope data to get the science, but we can go.
People were writing about it, talking about it.
Exactly.
And you could grow grapes in the
citrus.
UK.
Citrus in the north of England near Hadrian's Wall. The Romans were growing it there.
Well, there was
you can't do that now.
There was a period before you've named the eras have been named, and the Greeks have, when it was getting colder. What was that called?
The Greek Dark Ages.
The Greek Dark Ages.
There's a word I use often in the book, and that's horrific. And the horrific consequences to humanity and the human condition were during the cold periods. It's completely opposite of what we're being told. We're being told that CO2 is driving warming, which will lead to horrible consequences. That's not what history tells us. History tells us we should welcome the warmth and fear the cold.
Well, you make the point in this book, and I want to reemphasize this several times as we talk. Dr. Happer Will says that, and it's documented in here, that temperatures drive CO2. It's not the opposite. And so this notion of we're going to eliminate CO2 and change temperatures, it doesn't work that way. And I want to stick with this historical discussion because there's also this period that coincides exactly with the Roman Empire, which is when the earth warmed.
Yeah, that was the Roman warm period. And again, food was bountiful. And of course, the Romans conquered much of the world. The Roman army marched on its stomach. And the Roman Empire was fueled, and that Roman Empire was fed. Their food supplies were coming from North Africa, a lot of it. Egypt and Tunisia were the breadbasket of the Roman Empire at that time. We hardly think of Egypt being a breadbasket of the world today, but life was good for them, and there are a lot of reasons why the Roman Empire collapsed. It wasn't all due to climate. The previous warming trend, the Minoan warm period, the Bronze Age, clearly led to what's called the late Bronze Age collapse. And maybe in 50 or 100 years, all these great empires, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Harappan Empire in the Indus River Valley, all of those great civilizations collapsed within 50 or 100 years when it started getting cold. And so it's this strong relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of human civilization.
But I like the way you summarize the Romans, though. There's a reason they got to wear togas.
Exactly. Yeah, it was
warm. So, but when it got cold, that was around 400 AD, 500. That's when we went into the so-called Dark Ages, and that's when it got horrifically cold.
Yeah, and we know from the COVID era, we've all learned a little bit. We've learned that cold weather in the winter, we see an increase in flus and diseases, and it was exacerbated during the Dark Ages. Because think about it, they were huddled together in their wooden homes, in their homes, huddled together for warmth, maybe with animals in there. And so because of the cold temperatures, it was easy to spread diseases, fleas, rats, and the like.
And then we saw with COVID, cold temperatures are conducive to viruses. They do better in cold than they do in heat.
They are, and there are a lot of the consequences and deaths during the Dark Ages were due to the associated illnesses and diseases that came along, and didn't the High
Renaissance? I'm a history buff. I never really knew that the climate was that determinant here. Didn't the High Renaissance come about because it started warming up again?
Well, actually, the High Renaissance was pretty near the middle of the Ice Age, the Little Ice Age. But it didn't occur in Northern Europe. It occurred in Italy, where the Little Ice Age didn't matter.
Mediterranean climate.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you're thinking, I think, perhaps of what they call the High Middle Ages.
I'll have to
which
find-
would be
A little bit earlier, the High Middle
I'm sorry.
Ages was a warming period.
I was referring to the High Middle Ages.
High Middle Ages, yeah. That was definitely a warming period, absolutely. That was when the Norse, for example, farmed Greenland, which you can't do today. But there's wonderful evidence that they flourished for a couple hundred years.
And that's when all the Gothic cathedrals were built. With
That's
the,
right,
With the
that's right.
soaring things with a lot of glass, which
That's
you couldn't
right,
have
right.
if it was...
And they captured, too, things that makes it easy to understand that olive groves were much farther north during that period than even what they are today. So we can compare historical records of that time to what's actually going on now. Where are you going? Where can you grow citrus? Where can you grow
So
tropical?
what caused the climate to change in what roughly 400 or 500 year cycles where we had hot and then what causes the glaciers to come in and go out?
Well, I think the honest answer is that nobody knows, and getting the answer has probably been set back by at least 50 years by this, crazed fixation on carbon dioxide as the control knob of climate. It's clearly not the control knob of climate, and there are probably a number of control knobs, and we've neglected to try and investigate them because of obsession with CO2. So we've caused a lot of damage to real climate science by this obsession.
Well, clearly the CO2 emitted from the chariots was a big factor in the...
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've civilization flourished, waned, and then we got to around 1850, and I think it's helpful to bring it up to where we are, sort of post-industrial revolution. And I always thought that the industrial revolution is mainly driven by the ideas, and that the freedom and democracy and that sort of thing, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, they flourished. But you also attribute it to the weather getting better.
Well, let's go back, just step back one moment. Let's talk. The coldest period of the last 10,000 years was what Dr. Happer referred to as the Little Ice Age, horrifically cold. And just we know that, again, I like using historical records. Just south of where we are today, George Washington's at Mount Vernon, Martha loved ice in her summer drinks. And so he would have his slaves and servants go down to the Potomac River and cut the thick ice that accumulated every year up into his ice house. Well, the Potomac hasn't frozen like that in many decades. It rarely freezes over. So we know, just using historical records like that, we know it was really cold at that time. And so we've been warming since the late 17th century, more than 300 years. And the first 200 plus years of that had to be entirely naturally driven. But the others will tell you, but that's all changed in the middle of the 20th century. Now it's all being driven by carbon dioxide and our excesses and our sins, what I'll call the sins of emission. But that's just not the case. Those same natural forces that were driving temperatures since the time of George Washington upwards are in action today. They didn't go away.
Well, let's get to the what I think is a central point here, which is that, as I said in the introduction, and you two have written persuasively about this, and I think other people have, you've got a growing coalition of scientists that are, I won't call it a consensus because I don't like that word much anymore,
Yep.
but there are a lot of people who agree on the science, that CO2 is not the poison. CO2 is part of the solution. And one of the reasons that man-made CO2 emissions, and let's say there isn't a lot of man-made CO2 emissions, that's been beneficial because you've got some very interesting charts here about the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been dropping for tens of millions of years and was dropping precipitously till, around 1800, 1850, and then we started using fossil fuels, we started emitting CO2 from our activity, and that's actually raised the CO2 levels, which has been beneficial to agriculture and to human flourishing.
Yeah, you can see that directly from the yields of crops like wheat and soybeans and corn. And, There's been a recent study, a very good one, I think, that argues that about 40% of the increased yield has been from more CO2. There are other factors too, nitrogen fertilizer, which Greg mentioned, has been very important, and better cropping, better varieties of crops. They've all contributed, but CO2 has been a major factor, and we should be grateful for that. Who wants to give up 40% of the yield of agriculture? That you couldn't feed the world if we did that.
Yeah, and we see too, as you mentioned in the book, we capture from the UN data, we see that global food production, crop production, is greatly outpacing population growth. We often hear, well, the population's too large. Well, no, it's not. We're outpacing population growth with crop productivity. In the book, I capture the top 8 crops in terms of tons of production, and all 8 of those are breaking growth and production records year after year after year. And it's like Will said, it's attributable for the most part to CO2 fertilization effect more, but there's also the warming that we're seeing is hugely beneficial to agriculture. We know that the growing season in the continental United States has increased by more than 2 weeks since 1900. The warming is great. It means that killing frosts end earlier in the spring, arrive later in the fall.
Well, and also 20 times more people die due to cold than due to warmth. And so
That's right.
Why do we take vacations in
Wales? We're not seeing a
Hey,
population
darling, let's
growth.
go to Siberia.
Yeah.
Let's have a really cold, desolate vacation. This is Bill Walton, the Bill Walton Show, and I'm with Greg Wrightstone and Dr. Will Happer, who are leaders of the CO2 Coalition, and we're talking generally about the beneficial nature of CO2, but specifically, I think everybody listening to this needs to get a copy of A Very Convenient Warming. Subtitle is How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. And this is a really essential point for us to get, because people say, well, carbon may be bad, but it's an uneconomic thing to get rid of it, and we need to deal with it even though it's evil. Well, it's not evil.
You just threw me up a softball, so I'm going to hit it out of the park.
That's what I was trying to do.
All right.
But then
Well,
we also
thank you.
there's a difference between carbon and CO2. We'll get into that
That's
later
right.
on.
Dr. Happer's been a huge proponent here of the benefits of carbon dioxide. And if you had talked to me maybe 2 years ago, we'd talk a lot about that there is no climate crisis. And it's true, there isn't. And we can document that with science, facts, and data. But we've moved beyond that, and Dr. Happer predated me in this revelation. And what we see today, by almost every metric we look at, Earth's ecosystems are thriving and prospering, and the humanity is benefiting from modest warming and more CO2. It's what I call, Bill, the greatest untold story of the 21st century, that of a thriving Earth and an increase in the benefits to the human condition. And these are things that should be celebrated. Instead, they're demonizing it using false data, misinformation, and disinformation. The disinformation isn't coming from those of us that are skeptics. It's coming from those promoting climate crisis.
Yeah, let me just add a few words to that, Bill. If CO2 really were dangerous, if it really were a pollutant, then I would be on the side of Al Gore and Greta Thunberg. I would be out there pushing back against it. But I'm a scientist. I know more about radiation transfer than most people. And I know that CO2 really can't do the things that they're claiming, and there's no evidence for that. And I also know as a scientist that CO2 is tremendously beneficial to life. Greenhouse operators for years have doubled or tripled the amount of CO2 inside greenhouses, and you have to pay for it. It's not cheap. But it's worth buying the CO2 because the fruits and the vegetables and the flowers are so much higher quality as a result of the higher levels of CO2 that it more than pays for the cost of the CO2. Now, this is not driven by ideology. It's driven by the pure profit motive, and which is, I think, one of the purest motives that drive humans. I can understand
I'm
it
all
very
in favor.
clearly.
As a recovering
Yeah.
private equity guy,
Yeah,
I'm all
yeah.
in favor of the profit motive. Yeah. Well, why has the CO2 level in the atmosphere been declining for as long as it has? I mean, millions of years. You mentioned something. Don't want to get too scientific here, but there were some geologic reasons, and you're a trained geologist. And
Yeah, the biggest reason here is carbon sequestration, natural removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's through things like carbonate, limestone, and that's calcium carbonate. So it's removing carbon dioxide. It's also from coal formation, with the coal swamps, mainly the Carboniferous period, removed huge amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporated into the coal that's we're now liberating that carbon dioxide that was captured in the coal. It also was captured in oil and gas source rocks. A lot of these were algal blooms that need carbon dioxide and sunlight for photosynthesis that accumulated on the seafloor and are now turned into fossil fuels.
But none of those sound like man-made causes, and this is kind of what we need to get away from, this conceit. What was it? You had a quote in your book from John Kerry about how they were so fortunate to be gathered at Davos, who was the special nature of continue.
Yeah. Well, in my book, too, it was interesting. I've looked at it a little different way with fossil fuels. I call them nature's solar-powered batteries. So what they did, these fossil fuels, bear in mind coal, of course, were from mainly vegetation, trees, swamps that lived, died, accumulated, and then were buried and turned into coal. And they lived because of photosynthesis. What do we need for photosynthesis? Water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide, the better. Oil and gas, the source rocks, were again from photosynthesis of plankton and algal blooms. And so they use sunlight. So the sunlight powered the fossil fuels and created the fossil fuels we're using. And now we're liberating all that energy that was trapped in these fossil fuels. So we can actually view coal, oil, and gas as nature's solar-powered battery that we're now liberating and using for our betterment.
I think we've got our tagline for our movement here. It is. I mean, that's, you want solar. We've already
solar
got
power.
it. We've been using it for 150 years.
Exactly.
It's definitely true, yes. And I would just add to your question of why has it been going down, and it's true, over the last, 90 million years, CO2 has gradually been going down. And I think the honest answer is nobody's quite sure why. Greg had mentioned a number of things that clearly contributed.
Yeah.
Another thing I would add is that this has also been a period of mountain building. You know, the Himalayas started rising up some 60 million years ago, the Andes, and so much faster erosion than over many geological periods, which brings calcium ions and magnesium ions, which are necessary to form the carbonates that Greg mentioned, and the enormous beds of limestone, the chalk cliffs that we see in England. So that's probably at least partially associated with the mountain building that we're experiencing today.
Well, there's an illusion, too, that CO2 is some massive part of our atmosphere. Yes, the man in the street, what percentage of the air you breathe is carbon dioxide? And they'll say 20%, half. They don't know. I mean, see, this whole debate's going on, and we're supposed to radically transform all of civilization because of something that almost nobody understands.
Right.
And you've got some pie charts in your book which show that there's this big chart. I think what is the number one thing is water in the
vapor.
atmosphere, and then number two,
It's for greenhouse gas.
it's for greenhouse gases. Yeah, but then you get down to something. You've got a little slice here called trace elements, and then you have to break out a separate pie chart to show those trace elements.
Yeah.
And somewhere in there is carbon dioxide. What is it, like 0.04% of the total? 0.04. I mean, that's one.
It's minuscule, but it's very valuable and necessary. Without, although it's only 0.04% of the atmosphere, it's it's one of the most important. It's just as important to life on Earth as oxygen. And so the more of it, the better, as we can see, because we're actually living in an era that's CO2 impoverished.
Well, you talked about it, Will, as a high-powered. What was your analogy that you pour a dye into?
Well, CO2 actually, although it's a very tiny fraction of the atmosphere, 0.4%, it's very small.
Yeah.
Or is it 0.04?
I think it's 0.04.
0.04%. 0.04%. It is a very potent greenhouse gas in small amounts. So if you look at the greenhouse effect today, probably about 2/3 is due to water vapor. The other 1/3 is CO2. But the greenhouse effect doesn't increase very much. If you double CO2, it only changes the greenhouse effect by 1%.
That's the point I think we need to make.
Yeah.
You need to. There's a chapter in your book that frankly, I needed more coffee to really understand it. But evidently, once CO2 is out there and influencing whatever it influences, adding more doesn't really change much because it's already done its work.
That's right, Bill. I often try to explain it to my wife by saying, it's like painting a barn red. You know, if you have an old barn and you want it to look nice, you put a coat of red paint. If you think that's not red enough and it'll get redder by putting on a second coat of red paint, you're wasting your money. It won't make the slightest difference. Mm-hmm. So the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere today is a little bit like red paint. It acts much like paint, but it's the maximum amount you can put in, and it won't get any redder if you double it. It's like putting another coat of red paint on a barn. It won't get any redder. And so the technical term for that is saturation. It's something that's been well understood for 100 years or more. It happens in stars, and so there's nothing mysterious about it.
Well, I was referring to John Kerry and Al Gore. I mean, these men have massive, massive, massive egos, and they go to Davos, and they think, but John Kerry was explaining that he's like among gods. At Davos, these people understand the problems, and they're going to solve it for all of us little people, while he flies into Davos on his, Gulfstream 5, or maybe he's probably he might have a Boeing by now. I don't know, but. But we are not gods, and the Earth has been what it's been. The climate's been what it's been for hundreds of millions of years, and now all of a sudden we show up and we've got to reorder our whole economic, social system based on the ideas of these people. Your book is notoriously short on villains. Who is behind what I now think of as the lie that CO2 is so bad for us and that we need to reorganize things? Who's behind it?
Well, I think part of it is just groupthink. It's something that's been indoctrinated for many decades now. Young people have never heard anything different when they grew up, so you have to feel sorry for someone like Greta Thunberg who's never heard the truth. And so once you get a bad idea going, it's hard to get rid of it. So that's part of it. But I think there are some intentional efforts to keep this myth going. It started with organizations like the Club of Rome, who were looking for some sort of threat that people could unite against. And so we would fight climate change instead of fighting each other, or, that's the basic idea. It hasn't worked that way, and I'm not sure even the idea is correct. But there has been a deliberate promotion of the threat from CO2 when it's not a threat at all.
Well, what about we just finished reading. Sarah and I drive back and forth between our house and town and out in the country, and she reads aloud. And we've been reading. We finished *State of Fear* by Michael Crichton, and he has a very interesting idea that as soon as the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, the ruling class needed a new demon, a new enemy to label to keep all of us in a state of fear. And so they created this. The climate thing was created to keep us worried about something, so they could solve the problem that didn't exist and stay in power.
Yeah, I think Crichton was right, and I'm very sorry he's not with us today.
Yeah, wouldn't it be
was
great
a
to have here now?
wonderful voice for
Yeah.
rationality.
I capture some quotes from Michael Crichton. At the back of the book, I've got a notable quotables on consensus, and probably the quote from him that's most people use.
There is
And I'll let you read it.
here's Michael Crichton. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus,
That's right.
period.
That's right.
And, okay.
In fact, a little historical note, Greg wasn't there, but when we formed the CO2 Coalition, we talked about calling it the Crichton Coalition.
I was unaware of
And
that.
the only reason we didn't was we were unable to negotiate with the Crichton family the use of his name.
Well, he was famously a good businessman. I mean,
Yes.
so I guess his estate ended up with that attribute. So, but there are some, then now I think the problem we have is that the demon's been baked into our economic policy. We just passed an Inflation Reduction Act that is anything but. It's really the Green New Deal. And we've given John Podesta, who's, I think, one of Clinton's top advisors, a $400 billion slush fund to throw at wind and solar and batteries and things like that. And they're building in constituencies for this bad science all over America, all over the world, where local communities are investing in it, and now they feel like they're all in. How do we turn that around?
Well, we're doing our part by providing the science, the facts, and the data that dispute this need for carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah.
That disputes the notion that we need renewables like solar and wind that are actually economically and ecologically destructive. And so people need this information, the information that we provide at our website, co2coalition.org, within our books. Our members are huge writers. They're highly published.
Well, we, and I mean we, because now that I want to help us all succeed in getting the word out. You've read a section in here, you call it, "We must destroy the environment to save it."
Yeah, we see that. A great example there is this notion of extinctions. The UN claims that they're exploding. We're in the 6th grade extinction.
Species extension.
Species extinction.
Number of, okay.
Right, and we document that in the book that actually we're in a huge, significant decline. And in that UN report stated clearly that the greatest threat to our endangered species is habitat loss. What's their solution for curing a non-existent climate crisis? Destroy the habitat, pave over thousands of square miles with solar panel, and don't call them farms. They're not farms. They're industrial complexes. Cut down thousands of acres of mature forests that are either converted to wood pellets to be shipped to United Kingdom and call them green, and also to cut down huge swaths of our mountains to put the soaring wind turbines on the tops
Well,
of the
somebody
mountains.
calculated that to replace fossil fuels with wind and solar, you would need to cover about half of North America.
Yeah. Well,
Half.
the greatest example, Bill.
I mean-
if we look at just north of us here in Pennsylvania Game Commission controls 1.8 million acres in Pennsylvania, and the 18-member committee voted unanimously to permanently ban any wind turbine projects on their properties of the mountain ridges, because they said it was counter to their task, which is to preserve the animals and protect the animals and protect the mountains and the forests in Pennsylvania for sportsmen.
Well, and there's the other part where the manufacture of batteries, the manufacture of wind and solar equipment is massively destructive. The mining for one battery, I understand it, a 2,000-pound battery requires like 500,000 pounds of materials to be unearthed. And we've got to create new mines, and we've got to put those all over. And of course, we're not going to put them in Nantucket or what was it, Martha's Vineyard, where you're not. I'm sure they wouldn't want it there. We're going to put it in Africa, probably, or maybe Asia, but more likely Africa. And the other thing about this green agenda is that we've got 2 billion people in the world who are suffering extreme poverty, whether they live on $2 a day or something. And without fossil fuels, without cheap, abundant energy, which it provides, they're never going to get out of poverty.
Right, those people are cooking, bear in mind, they don't have access to electricity. There's some 800,000 people that die every year, according to the UN, of indoor smoke pollution from cooking on dried dung and wood in their homes. And what we're doing, following this Green New Deal, net zero, they're destining these people to continued generational poverty.
Could you explain net zero to me? I find it very hard to understand.
I'll let Will take a stab
We
at
need
that.
we need a big brain scientist.
Yeah.
How do we get to net zero?
How do we get to net zero?
Yeah.
We don't.
Well, it's a suicide pact. You know, if we all die, there will be zero emissions.
Yeah.
And if you really look at what's being proposed, it's pretty close to that. You know, it's like the People's Temple, you know, and Guyana, you know. So I think most people are not going to drink the Kool-Aid. So I think sooner or later this will collapse. And I hope it's sooner rather than later, because a lot of damage can be done. But it will eventually collapse because people don't want to commit suicide. You know, in Guyana, most of them didn't want to drink the Kool-Aid. They were forced to drink it, you know. So,
Yeah.
so we should keep an eye on who controls power, you know.
Well, I don't want to I want to stick with the science, but the philosophy of the Green Movement, or particularly the Club of Rome roots, seems to be profoundly anti-human, and they think fewer people on Earth is better than more. And you just described human flourishing, massive growth, and doubling lifespans because of the prosperity that was brought about in part by the global warming and in part by the fossil fuels revolution. They want to bring that to a halt.
Dr. Happer last year wrote an important paper with Richard Lenz, and in it, they concluded that this attempts for net zero, I believe you said that millions of people are likely to die. They're trying to ban nitrogen fertilizer and decrease carbon dioxide.
Yeah. And what's so ironic is if they are worried about the growth of the world population, you know, the demonstrated way to stabilize population is you make people prosperous. And so every prosperous country, whether it's the US or Europe or Japan or now even China, you know, the birth rate isn't enough to sustain the population. And so why wouldn't you want to make India prosperous or Africa prosperous so that people can have a decent life, you know, they can have the luxuries that everyone else in the world has, and they don't have to continue, you know, cooking with animal dung, you know. It's just crazy. I don't know why they're doing this.
Speaking of crazy, methane. Methane is even less of a trace gas than CO2, and methane's impact. Describe what methane does.
Well,
or doesn't.
methane is a greenhouse gas. It's sort of third after water vapor, CO2. Then comes methane. But methane its contribution to the warming is only about 1/10 that of CO2. And so CO2 itself isn't doing any harm. And so why we would go after methane, and the victims are farmers, for example. You know, all over the world, farmers are being attacked because their cattle are belching methane. You know, if you're a cow, you have to belch methane. You know, that's how you digest the fodder. And so I'm hoping that maybe the farmers will finally lead the world and push back against this craziness.
Well, it's happening. It's happening in Germany.
It's
of all
happening,
places.
yes, and it happened once in this country. There, the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard around the world, and maybe they'll do it again. But it's all of it is nuts. You know, it's all made up threats. You know, that empower a very small minority and cause enormous harm to everybody else in the world.
Well, that's what this, it seems like an elitist agenda to really stamp down or tramp down on people's happiness and flourishing. And the methane scheme also aimed at less meat, which people, and cows, I just learned, are probably why do we raise so much cattle? Well, the cattle can use land that's otherwise not usable. They're very sturdy.
That's right. Cattle are amazing. They can actually get food value from cellulose, which we can't.
Yeah.
From fiber. So they have this rumen, this special stomach that is full of microorganisms that are able to break down the cellulose and convert it into fatty acids and proteins, and the cow then converts that into beef and to milk and things that are good for the world. But in the process, you release a lot of methane. You can't metabolize cellulose without producing methane. So cows, termites, anything that does that has to produce methane. And it's completely harmless. It's been doing that for hundreds of millions of years, and it's caused no harm to the world.
And so the attack on methane is an attack on the farmers, attack on cows, attack on an abundant source of protein that would benefit everybody. And it's part of their secular religion, essentially.
That's right.
There's not a...
That's right. It's a religious dogma. It's not science. It's not altruism. It's dogma. And, we have to stop them as soon as possible.
Greg, how are we going to do that? Let's talk about the coalition. We're about to wrap up here. Tell us what we can do to get involved in what you're doing.
Well, the CO2 Coalition, we're very proud to be the leaders of it, Dr. Happer and I, and we're 150 of the top scientists in the world that are pushing back, that are climate skeptics. We've just brought on, for example, Dr. John Clauser, who was the 2022 Nobel laureate in physics. Hard to call him a science denier. We have Dr. Patrick Moore, who was a co-founder of Greenpeace until they lost their way. They all believe, as we do, that there is no climate crisis and that CO2 is a huge beneficial effect on the earth, and we need more of it, not less. And so we're trying to get our message out, but of course the mainstream media, and thank you very much for having us on, Bill, the mainstream media will not have this conversation, will not promote the science, the facts, and the data, but continue to promote this disinformation of a false climate crisis.
Well, assuming YouTube doesn't pull this show, they'll probably do what they did last time, is they'll give a context warning, which is that this does not comport with the United Nations IPCC.
I've been permanently banned on LinkedIn. That was a year and a half ago. My very last post, this is actually pretty funny. My very last post was, I believe I'm about to be banned and deplatformed by LinkedIn. They removed it, called it false and misleading, and then banned and deplatformed me. Now that's funny. It's true, but it's still, you got to laugh.
Yeah, but I think education is important. I mentioned the brainwashing that our poor children have gone through for, several generations now. And so one of the things that Greg is leading is a educational initiative. We have a learning center at the CO2 Coalition. You can click on the net and find material there, and we're working hard on that, trying to make it better.
So we find the website co2coalition.org?
Yes.
That's correct. And our companion is co2learningcenter.com, the educational initiative.
And you've had a wildly successful direct mail campaign, because people, it seems like once you get exposed to the truth about what's happening, it's very intuitive and very, yeah, that makes sense.
We're seeing response from people around the country that is unprecedented, we're told. And so people are responding to, because we're actually doing something to fight back against the nonsense. We're doing something to fight back against our children and grandchildren being indoctrinated into this climate cult. We're promoting critical thinking skills and the scientific method. They're promoting groupthink and indoctrination. This has to stop, and so we're actually doing something at the CO2 Coalition about that.
Dr. Will Happer, Greg Wrightstone, CO2 Coalition. Thrilled. We'll be back. We got a lot more to do here. We covered, you all ought to buy this book, A Very Convenient Warming. We covered about 2% of the interesting material in it, but we'll also cover some in future shows. Anyway, this has been the Bill Walton Show, and I'm Bill Walton, and you can find our show almost always on YouTube, unless we go against the science consensus. Rumble, Substack, our show's posted there on all the major audio podcast platforms. If you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe and ask your friends to subscribe. I think we go deep into some interesting topics that other people aren't covering with experts you normally don't get an opportunity to hear. So this is the place, and thanks for joining, and I hope you found this interesting, and we'll talk with you next time.